All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going deep into the urban combat. Really, really brutal stuff. The Battle of Manila, February to March 1945. You provided some really incredible material on the U.S. Army tactics in that fight. Really, really intense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to emphasize right off the bat that Manila wasn't just some sideshow in the Pacific. We're talking about a major urban center. And the fight for it, absolutely ferocious. Over 100,000 Filipino civilians killed during the battle. On top of that, over 1,000 American soldiers killed, 5,500 wounded. And this was against what, about 16,000 Japanese defenders?
60,000 dug in and ready to fight.
Absolutely. When you look at it on paper, it really is a textbook example of attacking a fortified enemy in a dense urban environment. The challenges there are just immense.
Yeah. No, I mean, that comes through so clearly in the material. And, for all of you military professionals listening in, I think that's what we really want to focus on today, right? Those key takeaways, those hard-won insights into urban combat, the tactics the U.S. Army used, the challenges of facing a fortified enemy, how they brought together all their different combat arms, the air, the artillery, the infantry. And then, of course, one of the things that really jumps out from this material is the complexity of operating in a place with so many civilians.
Right. Trying to achieve a military objective when you have a huge civilian population that you're also trying to protect.
Right, exactly. And, these are all lessons that I think still resonate today,
Mm.
lessons that we can apply to contemporary military thinking, contemporary warfare. So I think with all of that said, maybe the best place to start is with the tactics themselves. How did the U.S. Army actually approach the fight? Going house to house, street to street. How did they do it in Manila?
Well, you can see right away in the material that the layout of the city is just so dense, it forced them to change their tactics. They couldn't just do these big sweeping advances down streets. They had to fight for every building. It was really granular.
I'm guessing that meant they had to come up with some pretty specialized techniques for getting into those buildings.
Exactly. Yeah, you see all kinds of things mentioned in the reports,
Hmm.
like using explosives to blow holes in walls, or, and this was even more tactical, trying to enter buildings through the roof, or
Hmm.
going in through the upper floors, that kind of thing. Why go in through the ground floor if that's where they expect you?
Right, right. Bypass those heavily defended areas,
Hmm.
go for the less obvious route. So once you're inside, you've got these assault teams going in. What did those teams look like? What kind of firepower did they bring with them?
Well, it's important to remember these weren't your average rifle squads. They were equipped specifically for close quarters combat. Really nasty stuff. They had flamethrowers, super effective for clearing rooms and bunkers really quickly. Grenades, obviously, essential for room-to-room fighting. And then for those really tough obstacles, they had bazookas, demolition charges, that sort of thing. And it wasn't just them going in alone. They had machine gunners and mortar teams covering fire while they made their assault.
So you really get a sense of this incredibly intense, close-range fighting happening all over the city. And, one thing the material keeps coming back to is this idea that they had to treat every building as its own fortress.
Right. Yeah. Every single building had to be breached, cleared out room by room, and then secured before they could move on to the next one. You can imagine how slow and costly that process was. It took a lot of time and, unfortunately, a lot of lives.
And then on the other side of it, you have the Japanese defenders.
Mm.
And the sources really paint this picture of Manila being transformed into this, incredibly formidable fortress. Can you give us some specifics about the kind of defensive measures they put in place? I mean, it sounds like they really made it tough for the Americans.
Oh, they absolutely did. The thing that struck me was how proactive the Japanese naval troops were. They weren't just sitting back waiting to be attacked. They were actively adapting to the urban environment. So you have these large, sturdy concrete buildings being turned into strong points. They were barricading windows, putting sandbags up on roofs to protect against attacks from above. And then they had these things called murder holes, which are basically just small openings for firing on anyone trying to advance.
Yeah, murder holes.
Yeah.
It's a pretty chilling term. But I mean, it gets the point across. But it wasn't just above ground, right? The material also mentions how they were using tunnels and sewers to move around.
Yeah, that was a big factor. They were using the city's underground infrastructure to their advantage. They could move through these tunnels and sewers without being detected by the Americans. And that was a problem for the U.S. because it meant their air power and artillery, which were usually huge advantages, weren't as effective. The Japanese could just disappear underground and pop up somewhere else.
That must have been a real headache, tactically speaking. So you've got these underground tunnels. What about their more conventional defenses? the stuff they had set up at street level.
Well, they had set up these overlapping fields of fire. So if you're trying to cross a street or go through an intersection, you'd be caught in a crossfire. They were using pillboxes, and they even salvaged naval cannons and repurposed them for use in the city.
So they were really using anything they could get their hands on.
Absolutely. And on top of all that, they were using a ton of booby traps and mines. And I'm not just talking about small mines. They were burying these huge aerial bombs in the city.
Wow. Talk about desperate. Using aerial bombs as mines in a city. And the destruction of the city itself must have created more obstacles, right?
Absolutely. I mean, all the rubble from destroyed buildings and bridges, it wasn't just collateral damage. It was actually a major obstacle for both sides.
Right.
Made it really difficult to move troops and vehicles around. And of course, because the fighting was so close quarters, there were no clear front lines. It was really easy to mistake friendly forces for the enemy.
Well, I can only imagine.
Yeah.
And then you add in the fact that the Japanese were basically ordered to fight to the death, no surrender. That had to have a huge impact on how the Americans approached the battle.
It did, yeah. It meant that negotiation was off the table. There was no possibility of bypassing certain areas. They had to fight for every single position, which obviously led to more casualties and made the battle drag on. It's interesting, the source material actually goes into some specific examples of how different units approached these challenges in different parts of the city.
Yeah, yeah. And I think those examples really bring it all to life. So let's talk about some of those. We've got the 1st Cavalry Division, their flying column up in North Manila. They were the ones who liberated the internons at San Tomas University. That was early in the battle, February 3rd. What was their main objective there?
Speed was absolutely key for them. They had to get to the university and free those civilians as fast as possible. They did run into some resistance, but it wasn't as heavy as in other parts of the city. The big challenge was the Japanese trying to use the internees as hostages.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the 1st Cavalry had to be really careful. They couldn't just go in guns blazing. But it wasn't just about rescuing the internees. They also had to secure Manila's water supply, make sure the Japanese didn't sabotage it. That could have been disastrous for the civilian population. It really shows how important it is to take control of those key pieces of infrastructure early on in an urban fight.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, water is essential, especially in a situation like that. So you've got a humanitarian mission and a strategic objective, all in one.
Yeah.
Now, the 37th Infantry Division, they had a really tough assignment. They were the ones pushing into downtown Manila. And the material mentions that crossing the Pasig River under fire was a particularly nasty business.
Yeah, the 37th were a veteran division, but they were facing the most heavily defended sector of the city. Crossing a river under enemy fire is never easy, and they took a lot of casualties getting across the Pasig. Once they were on the other side, they ran into incredibly heavy resistance at the Manila post office. That building was massive, with these really thick walls. It was basically a fortress in the middle of the city.
They must have brought some serious firepower to bear on that.
They did, yeah. It took days of shelling at close range before they could even attempt an assault. The 37th also ended up recapturing the main power station, which was on Provisor Island, another vital piece of infrastructure. You know, these key nodes in the city, if you can take control of them, it really weakens the enemy, and it helps you support your own troops, not to mention the civilians.
Okay, so we've got the 1st Cavalry up north, 37th downtown. There's also mention of the attack on the Rizal baseball stadium, which the Japanese were using as an ammo dump.
Yeah.
How did they handle that?
Well, they basically hit it with everything they had. I mean, that stadium was a huge target, strategically speaking. So they sent in the Sherman tanks and just started blasting those dugouts and bunkers underneath the stands. Just point-blank direct fire. It was so intense that the Japanese had to pull back. It really shows you the power of tanks in an urban environment, even though they can be vulnerable in those narrow streets.
Yeah, yeah. If you can get him in the right position, they can be devastating. The source material also talks about the 11th Airborne Division down south. They came up against the Genko line, which I guess was a pretty heavily fortified defensive line.
Oh, yeah. The Genko line was a network of pillboxes and bunkers, all very well built. It was tough going for the 11th Airborne. They had to rely on a lot of close quarters firepower to get through those defenses. Flamethrowers, demolition charges, white phosphorus grenades, you name it. And they had artillery and light tanks supporting them, of course. But it was a slow, grinding advance. They had to fight for every inch of ground across Nichols Field and the surrounding suburbs. It was a real attritional fight. It shows you what happens when you attack prepared defenses in a city. You need a lot of firepower, and you need it to be really well coordinated.
And then, we've got to talk about Intramuros. That's the old walled city. And it sounds like it was a completely different kind of challenge, fighting in a medieval fortress in the middle of a modern battle.
Yeah, Intramuros was a beast. Those walls were massive, like 40 feet thick. And inside, it was just this maze of old buildings. The Americans decided to hit it with a massive artillery bombardment before sending in the infantry.
I guess there was no other way.
It was pretty much unavoidable. So the 37th Infantry Division went in on February 23rd. They attacked the walls from all sides, and then it was just this brutal room-to-room fight inside the city. And all this time, they were trying to rescue civilians who were trapped in there. It's a tough situation, you know. You've got this heavily fortified position, and you need to neutralize it, but you're also trying to minimize civilian casualties.
It's that balance again,
Yeah.
trying to achieve the mission while also protecting innocent lives.
Exactly. And it's never easy, especially in a place like that. And, looking back at all these different unit actions, I think it really highlights the importance of what they call combined arms. Bringing together the infantry, the tanks, the artillery, all working together. The material talks about how important that was in Manila.
Yeah. I mean, we've touched on it a bit already, but maybe we can unpack that a little more. For our listeners who might not be as familiar with that concept, how did those different arms, those different branches work together in Manila, and why was it so important?
Well, Manila was a brutal but valuable lesson in how essential combined arms are in urban warfare. Each branch had its own strengths and weaknesses. Take tanks, for example. They're incredibly powerful, but in a city with all those narrow streets, they're vulnerable to ambushes and anti-tank weapons. But if you can get them into a good position, they can just blast through enemy defenses. They were literally knocking down walls in Manila.
And then you've got the artillery, which is traditionally thought of as a long-range weapon.
Mhm.
How were they using it in an urban environment?
Well, they were actually using it for direct fire in a lot of cases. So instead of lobbing shells from miles away, they were aiming them directly at buildings at close range to create breaches that the infantry could exploit. And the engineers, they were absolutely essential. They were working alongside the tanks and infantry, clearing rubble, disarming mines, creating paths for the troops to move through. And the thing is, when you bring all of these elements together, they amplify each other's effectiveness. It's not just about adding more firepower, it's about using that firepower intelligently and in a coordinated way.
So how did that coordination work in practice? You mentioned tanks and infantry working together. What did that look like on the ground?
Well, you'd have the tanks engaging enemy strong points, drawing their fire, and while they were doing that, the infantry would be moving in close, clearing out buildings, making sure the enemy couldn't get close enough to the tanks to use their anti-tank weapons. So the tanks were protecting the infantry, and the infantry were protecting the tanks.
It's a real team effort.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just tanks and infantry. The artillery was also closely coordinated. They had forward observers embedded with the infantry who could call in fire support exactly where it was needed. And that was crucial in a city like Manila, where it was so easy to hit your own troops by accident. And, earlier we talked about MacArthur wanting to minimize civilian casualties. But the reality was that the Japanese were fighting so fiercely that the Americans had to resort to these massive artillery barrages in some areas, especially around Intramuros.
So it's a trade-off, right? Trying to
Right.
protect civilians versus trying to win the battle.
Exactly. And it's a trade-off that commanders have to grapple with in every urban conflict. But at the end of the day, the close coordination between the artillery, the tanks, the mortars, and the infantry, that was really the key to victory in Manila. They couldn't have done it without that combined arms approach.
And of course, we can't talk about Manila without talking about the human cost, especially for the civilian population. The source material talks about how many civilians were killed and how difficult it was for the Americans to operate in a city with so many non-combatants.
It's a really tragic aspect of the battle. MacArthur, he wanted to minimize civilian casualties. He really did. But the Japanese committed some terrible atrocities against the Filipinos, and the fighting itself was just so destructive, so intense, that it was impossible to avoid a high civilian death toll. When you're fighting in a city, the lines between combatants and civilians get blurred, and innocent people inevitably get caught in the crossfire.
And despite all of that, did the Americans make any effort to protect the civilians?
Oh, yeah. I mean, they did their best. There were plenty of examples of American soldiers rescuing Filipino civilians. And the mission to liberate Santo Tomas, that was all about saving those internees. But, when you're fighting an enemy that's dug in and determined to fight to the death, you have to use a lot of firepower. And that firepower inevitably causes destruction and it causes civilian casualties. It's a horrible dilemma. The Americans were constantly trying to balance the need to defeat the enemy with the need to protect innocent lives. And sometimes, those two goals were just in direct conflict with each other.
Yeah, it sounds like an incredibly difficult situation. And, we've talked about the tactical challenges, the human cost. But the Battle of Manila also had a lasting impact on how the U.S. military thinks about urban combat. What were some of the key lessons that were learned from that battle? Lessons that went on to shape doctrine and training.
Well, I think the biggest takeaway was the absolute undeniable importance of combined arms operations. That's not just some abstract concept. It was proven in blood in Manila. And that lesson, it was carried forward into future conflicts like the Korean War and the Vietnam War, the fighting in Seoul and Hue City. Those battles showed how important it was to integrate the infantry, the armor, the artillery, the engineers, all working together seamlessly.
So Manila provided a blueprint, in a way.
Yeah, you could say that. It showed what worked and what didn't work in urban combat. And another big lesson was that the defenders have a huge advantage in urban terrain. It's just so easy to fortify buildings, to set up ambushes, to disappear into the maze of streets and alleys. So for the attackers, it means you have to be incredibly careful. You need good intelligence, you need a solid plan, and you need to move slowly and deliberately. That's why you see in later conflicts the U.S. military trying to isolate cities, trying to cut off the enemy's supply lines before they launch any kind of major assault.
Trying to avoid that kind of grinding block by block fight that they had to go through in Manila.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the issue of critical infrastructure. We talked about the 1st Cavalry securing the water supply, the 37th recapturing the power station. That stuff is vital. If you can control those key nodes in a city, you can really cripple the enemy. And you can help your own troops and the civilians. It's a huge strategic advantage.
So securing infrastructure, combined arms operations, and what about the civilian population? Did that experience in Manila change how the U.S. military thought about operating in cities with a lot of civilians?
It definitely did. The high number of civilian casualties in Manila, it was a real wake-up call. It showed that commanders had to be prepared to deal with large-scale humanitarian crises, and they had to factor the presence of civilians into every aspect of their planning. The rules of engagement, the way they used firepower, everything had to take the civilians into account. It's a really difficult challenge, and there's no easy answer. But Manila showed that you can't just ignore the civilian population. You have to do everything you can to protect them, even in the middle of a brutal fight.
It's that balancing act again, right? The military objective versus the humanitarian imperative.
Yeah, and it's something that every military professional has to wrestle with. So, to sum it all up, Manila was a horrific battle, but it was also an incredibly valuable learning experience. The lessons that were learned there, they shaped U.S. military doctrine for decades, and they're still relevant today.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about a lot of those lessons today. The importance of combined arms, the advantages that defenders have in cities, the need to secure infrastructure, the challenges of protecting civilians. And for all of you listening, especially those of you in the military, I think the Battle of Manila offers a lot of food for thought. It really shows the complexity of urban warfare, and it raises a lot of questions. Questions that I think are worth pondering, even today. Like, how do those lessons from Manila apply to the kinds of conflicts we're seeing now? How do we adapt those lessons to the modern battlefield, which is constantly evolving?
Yeah, you think about the kinds of cities we have today, the technology that's available, the nature of the threats we're facing. It's all so different from what the soldiers in Manila experienced. But the fundamental challenges of urban warfare, they haven't gone away. And I think it's really important for us to think about those challenges, to study those lessons from the past, and to figure out how we can apply them to the future.
So, a lot to think about. And we'll leave it there for today. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
See you next time.